University. I'm an occasional science consultant for the Star Trek universe.
And I'm Dr. Anne-Marie Siegel. I'm a physician. I went to Penn for undergrad and studied some biology, nowhere near as much as Dr. Mohammed Noor. And then went to medical school in Wisconsin and did some surgery residency and research in immunology, which I'm sure will come up later today.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan / fanatic.
Oh, yes. I'm with you on that. Also a lifelong Star Trek fan and fanatic. So this is an attempt to bring together two different perspectives. So I've given talks at sci-fi conventions before. I often get asked these medical questions. My answer is always like, I'm not an MD. So I reached out to my great friend, Dr. Anne-Marie Siegel, and said, hey, you're an MD and you know Star Trek even better than me. So why don't we talk together? I'll present the genetics perspective. You could present the medical perspective on all these questions. So we have a couple of prepared questions, and we also have some contributed ones from people out there in social media. Any thoughts before we jump in, Dr. Anne-Marie?
No, just can't even wait to get started.
Same. Thank you again for doing this with me. I really appreciate it too. So we're going to go to start with by a couple of different series. Let's start with the original series. So there was an episode called the Omega Glory in this series. There's a planet that had experienced a biological war involving a virus early on. A lot of the population had died and the virus was still around, but something in the environment now neutralizes the virus shortly after infection. So Captain Tracy thinks that whatever is happening on this planet also cures aging of the people there. And that's why we have people on this planet who live hundreds or maybe thousands of years. So Dr. Anne-Marie, any thoughts on the episode in general or on the long life aspect?
The long life aspect was very fun. Especially the part where like Kirk and Spock are in prison with those are the Yanks, right?
Yes.
Like the Yanks. So the Yanks demonstrate that they have like basically superior strength and they break those bars. So I kind of felt like, you know what, that's maybe one of the first clues that it's not just long life. There's something else attached to what's going on. Also, to say like they don't age, I just wanted to know, Captain Tracy hadn't been there that long, probably a couple of years back. So really, like, how does he know how long is going on before they age and how long the world turned? Oh, I guess they knew about like how many rotations of whatever that thing was, 42 times, and that only happens
like Blackbird or something like that. Yeah.
But I just don't know like he didn't really have that big of a time frame to base it on. It was sort of just maybe word of mouth. But yeah, like there were some red flags with the strength and things like that. And everybody seemed super fit.
Well, that's Hollywood in general, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So their explanation for it was really interesting in that they basically said it wasn't anything about the planet that would make people strong, but that as a result of this biological war, a lot of people had died. And only some people who had, extra strong immunity or immune responses were the ones who lived. So in essence, what had happened is they'd applied natural selection. They never used the word natural selection in the episode. There was just a vague comment of survival of the fittest. Mm-hmm. But that is, in essence, referring to natural selection. So what that is taking that segment of the population that has the highest immune response and saying those are the ones who live on. And then maybe even among that subset, maybe the ones with the highest immune response also have the most kids. So then over the course of a couple of generations, you get more and more, immune response, better antibodies, something like that. Now it's interesting because that's an accurate depiction of natural selection. So 2 thumbs up to Classic Trek for getting some science right on that. Mm-hmm. Less clear how well antibody responses to viruses would actually extend your life by, tenfold or more.
It seemed like it was interesting that Captain Tracy had really latched onto that, and then McCoy. I don't know that I would naturally go to that. It could be anything.
Yeah.
And in that Deep Space Nine episode where the Jem'Hadar are stranded on the planet, and they're also talking about like evolving beyond needing to use the Ketracel White. Mm-hmm. They didn't necessarily. It's interesting looking as we like talk about these things. Looking at 2 episodes back to back to see like how the science maybe decades before what led them to and what leads you to now. And it was interesting that in the Deep Space Nine episode, they don't just jump to conclusions and start bandying the word antibodies all over.
No, agreed. Well, it's interesting because a lot of aging now is thought to be associated. I mean, of course, people do die from diseases and lack of antibodies there, but a lot of aging now is thought to be associated with the shortening of telomeres, which are the end caps on all your different chromosomes. So we humans have 23 pairs of all our chromosomes, and over time, as they're replicated, you don't quite get to the very end with the replication, so you lose a little bit of the cap. And after a while, you get past the repetitive part of the cap, and you start actually losing genes that actually have important functions. So that's thought to be one of the reasons that we actually do age, and one of the reasons that's good to go ahead and renew by having this new offspring that has full-length chromosomes again. So, but the antibody thing presumably wouldn't have affected that, but it's a neat idea nonetheless.
Yeah, and sort of like a little bit of a passing of fancy in the episode, because they kind of that part gets abandoned kind of early on, and then they just talk about survival of the fittest. But there's a lot of fighting going on and fight scenes, so I think they have a little less time to talk about like the science and to wrap all of that up with them.
Oh, that's true.
But we did get to see the fantastic spear budget on
oh yes
Star Trek the original series, which also is quite impressive.
And you make a great point too, that and I always raise this with my friends who are scientists too, that they always say, oh, they didn't explain blah 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 sufficiently. Like, they're not going to give a freaking seminar on Star Trek. It's just,
and sometimes like it is science fiction, so what I really love that they do in all of these episodes that we're going to talk about is they draw on some really interesting concepts that really fuel the imagination, and then go from there. And you don't really need to have like the nitty gritty, because it's enough just to have the concept to think about it. And then if you want to take it to the next level, talk about it with your nerdy friends.
Yay, which we get to do right now.
Yes.
100% agree. And the bottom line is, it is science fiction. It's okay that it's a story, but it's fun to actually capitalize on some of these things to share some true science knowledge with people, like the snippets from it, like, oh look, this is based on something real, or oh, here's how this may have worked. So maybe if they wanted to do something like that, maybe the biological weapon could be something that shrinks telomeres really fast or something. I don't know.
Oh, interesting. so interesting.
So that maybe
it makes them wobble.
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts on that one? Or should we move on to the next episode?
Okay, well, I'm a 90s Star Trek.
Totally fair.
That has my heart. So
totally
let's
fair.
move on,
I'm an
even
old
though
man,
I do love Captain Kirk.
All right, let's talk about the next generation. So let's talk about the episode Up the Long Ladder. So there was an interesting discussion of genetic diversity. There is, on the planet Mariposa, which I think was also the name of the ship that should have dropped the people off there. There were only 5 survivors on that planet originally, and deciding that was not a significant enough breeding stock, as they called it, they decided, we're going to just make clones of ourselves. So now, generations later, they see what they refer to as replicative fading. Essentially, you're making a copy of a copy of a copy, and then copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And just like if you were doing that with a book on a Xerox or regular standard paper copier, eventually you start losing words that are pieces you can't see anymore. So what they said is they need an infusion of new genetic material, and that's where they want to steal these stomach epithelial stem cells. I have some thoughts, but you want to go first?
Well, I mean, just the general thoughts, which were so interesting about this episode. So first of all, so there were 2 women and 3 men in this insufficient gene pool. So I'm like, my thought would be, why not work on, have a generation or 2 of children, and then you can go to cloning when you have more
more diversity.
Exactly. And then the other thing that was interesting was when they're trying to get more genetic material from Riker and Pulaski, for example, which also kind of felt a little weird that they didn't get genetic material from Geordi, I guess because he's blind and they didn't want that. I'm like, he's one of the MVPs.
Yeah, he's an MVP too. I would love somebody as smart as Geordi. Oh my gosh.
It's crazy that they did that. But so then they just start talking about getting their DNA and doing clones and going directly from there again, which I'm like, if you have more DNA coming in, then again, you have an opportunity to sort of mix up your genetic diversity the old fashioned way before you go right. They became very addicted to cloning.
Yeah. It's a funny, I mean, that's a brilliant idea. I hadn't thought of that idea of maybe mixing it up first, making a broader pool of yes, it's the same raw material,
just a Band-Aid a little
different
bit.
Combinations.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still probably going to be insufficient genetic material, but still, it helps you a little bit. And
totally.
Yeah, it just seems like they really ran to that.
Yeah.
Really quick.
I love the scenes where they were getting the stomach material. It's very dramatic, like holding the syringe really
Oh
high.
my gosh, that was crazy too, because also the whole time I was watching that syringe go into the abdominal cavities, and yeah, it was super dramatic. They must have had like a minute to kill, and they were like short on material, but they were like dropping the syringe, right? Like, I guess they're like they're lying down, so hopefully like they weren't angling at all to make sure they were into the stomach.
Yeah.
Also, people's like abdominal contents can shift a little bit back and forth. Like, you do not want to be sticking a needle in somewhere where like a loop of bowel might get in the way, and then you'll perforate the bowel. It'll be a major surgery. They'll have an acute abdomen, and like then the cat will definitely be out of the bag that they interfered with them to get their material. But
it was neat
also,
that they, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it was interesting that they picked specifically these stomach epithelial cells, which are thought to be stem cells. So stem cells, for anybody who isn't familiar, are ones that haven't differentiated. So like if you imagine like a one cell embryo, it obviously can become anything. You know, the cells that are descended from it can become skin or muscle or whatever. So these ones in the lining of your stomach are ones that can actually differentiate into specific other kinds of cells, into a whole variety of them. So it makes sense to grab one of those as opposed to like a skin cell, which only can produce more skin cells. So that aspect was interesting, and thumbs up to that.
And super like on trend with the pulse of 1990. I think
Very
that
much
was
so.
actually 1988. Or
yeah, it was right on the border. Right on the border. Yeah, I'm not sure what date.
But like to be able to kind of like insinuate mature versus immature stem cells, where like you want the least mature, the least specific, so that it can make an abundance of things later on.
Yeah.
Hopefully. So it was just really fascinating. Like that was all in the newspapers, especially during that time frame, and they just like beautifully incorporated it into Star Trek, I thought.
Excellent. You're about to say something else before that? I have another thought too, but you do your other thought first, please.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering why the guy from the Planet of the Clones, when he was like on board having drinks in that in the observation deck, I think that's what they call a conference room on Enterprise D. I was just like, man, if I was him, I'd be like taking everybody's cups, trying to like take some loose hair off the back of their uniform, just like, because obviously they didn't have that many scruples.
Yeah, see, so, I think the key was the same point here was about the stem cells. Like, I don't think they had the ability to basically make a cell become a stem cell again, which I know now we can do that a little bit better than we could back in the 1980s, 90s. But back then, you know, you get a cell, if you get a skin cell, like, well, I can make some more skin, I guess.
I thought it was really great. And I really liked the idea of like, well, they did sedate them a little bit. I mean, their eyes were open, but clearly they gave them some sort of like anxiolytic.
Yeah.
And I thought that worked well too, because like sometimes, especially for surgeries or like even smaller surgeries, when you get put to sleep, you have like benzodiazepine that sort of doesn't necessarily wipe your memory, but it makes it so that you might be a little less prone to having like a sharp short-term memories around that time period. So that worked really well in the context of the episode, where it's just because Geordi was around. And also I love that little snippet of Geordi being able to tell people are lying because he sees the reactions of lying better. So cool. And also based in the truth, like people do like speed up their heart rate a little bit. People do dilate a little bit. But maybe if you're not like trained with as a spy, you don't notice it as much. But I was so proud of Geordi for really advancing this plot.
100% agree. Now, it was interesting to me, the replicative fading aspect is a real thing. That term is something they made up, which honestly is better, I think, than the real term. The real scientific term is referred to as Muller's ratchet, mostly because this guy named Muller had elaborated. And a ratchet, you know, turns things in one direction, but then when you turn it the other way, it doesn't go back. So that's why they call it Muller's ratchet. But it's this idea of the accumulation of bad mutations in asexual or clonal populations that, you know, basically you just go generation to generation, and everybody has bad mutations or just mutations in general. So like I, for example, probably have tens or hundreds of mutations of some type relative to my parents. And it's thought that on average, at least with humans and with fruit flies, that there's on average one bad mutation, like in an evolutionary sense, not necessarily like bad, like it's immediately causing a disease, but in an evolutionary sense, something that won't persist over time. So if everybody gets one bad mutation and a whole bunch of others, it's pretty quick that you're going to get pretty bad off. And that's why it's thought that a lot of asexual species don't persist as asexual for very long, but will have some bit of exchange of genetic information in some way, shape, or form. So again, like if you imagine like two books where you're making copies and they get worse over time, if you can then pick words from this book and words from that book, you might be able to reconstitute a good book again. That's essentially what's going on with that. So that's Mulder's ratchet or replicative fading, but they came up with a better term actually for it. Like, wow, I should use that in my class from now on.
It is so good. And there are a couple of terms, especially in these TNG episodes or like the very early Deep Space Nine Voyager, where I watched it during when it was on. It was like end of elementary school, junior high.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I actually think because I heard them in Star Trek and knew they were correct from like my science classes going on, I actually thought those are real terms.
Oh, wow.
It happens again with the phage that we talk about later. But these two are definitely examples where for years, I just assumed that was like a normal term to describe some of these things.
Cool.
That's how good Star Trek is.
That's a great transition point too there. So like introduced in Next Generation, but more elaborated in Deep Space Nine, we have the Trill species. So the Trill are what they refer to as a joined species. So there's a humanoid, but the humanoid is largely serving as a host. And there's this like large slug-like thing that's housed in the belly of the Trill. And somehow it's actually controlling the behaviors. They have a shared consciousness even associated with that. I'm curious. I have some thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first, Dr. Hammerby.
Well, I know like in Deep Space Nine, they elaborate occasionally in episodes as a side note about like how there's some like intervascular and also neural connections that are made in those after those first few hours of joining that then become really hard to break. And that's sort of how it's explained how like the symbiont stays alive in the person and how how their thoughts are shared and how they depend on how the host's feeling. But one really interesting thing that is differentiated between TNG and Deep Space Nine is what they call it symbiosis.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit hard to think how in the host in Next Generation, how it's really a mutual like agreement, beneficially.
Yeah.
Mutually beneficial.
Let's introduce some terms right there. So symbiosis just means two species that live in very, very close proximity. And the types of symbiosis could be mutualism, as you were just alluding to, or commensalism, where like it's kind of random, they don't really affect each other, or parasitism, which is, parasites is bad for the host. So just want to introduce those terms.
I love it. So you wonder in TNG, I know the host seems willing, especially that host that comes in at the end, but you can't help wondering, like, is it a little bit parasitic? Because this host it just seems like they're just being farmed to be a
kind of are
like vessel for the space worm. Whereas like in Deep Space Nine, it seems like the hosts really get a lot out of the relationship too. It's more fulfilling. They get all this access to like memories and they really enjoy that part. And also you sort of not live forever because I don't think the symbionts can live forever, but you sort of there's a part of you left for centuries to come. So it's interesting how that symbiotic relationship seems to like change forms a little bit, and in my opinion get less problematic, and that way it's a bit more feel good to hear about hear about it, as opposed to like the TNG episode where in the end the host is just like giving its body and you're just it's
not clear what they get. Like, you're right. It's not obviously mutualistic at all. Yeah.
And they just seem so like neutral. And you kind of wonder, like, have they been genetically altered just to be a vessel? Like,
or maybe it's one of those things where the host, maybe the symbiote is giving some sort of drug that makes the host feel good about like, but it's actually not good for it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, just random thought. No, it's interesting because we actually, to some extent, we are symbionts ourselves. Because I mean, we have like a massive microbiome in our body. We like to think of ourselves as one thing, but I mean, if you got rid of all of our bacteria and associated organisms, we'd be in really, really terrible shape. And this comes up in the context of often when people take antibiotics, they have some sort of bad reaction in parts of their body, in gut or in reproductive areas or something like that. So I mean, we're kind of like that, but the more commonly talked about joined species is sort of the lichen, right, which has algal and fungal components together, and they live out there in the wild. So it's neat to see that. I was trying to think of something that had the mind link, and the only thing I call it, this isn't really a mind link. This is actually a really bad. This is definitely parasitic, but you probably remember this a couple of years ago. There was this fungus that was found that could control ants' behaviors, but essentially what it did, it severed the control of the brain from the rest of the body, and it would make the ants climb up onto these stalks of grass and then just sit there, and then the fungal fruiting body would like burst out.
Is it like mean, this is worse than the worst horror story.
Oh yeah, it's a lot like
You
it's a
couldn't
lot like
even
Alien,
dream
except
that.
Alien controls you right before you die.
Oh my gosh. Like, can you
Or
imagine if they could control our bodies and we just have to sit there while they eat us?
yeah, oh, it's terrible.
I guess that is a little bit like Species 8472 in Voyager,
A
but
little bit, a little bit.
oh, scary.
Oh man. Well, speaking of scary, let's move on to Voyager. We might come back to some of these other series too.
Yeah.
We're about on schedule, so that's good. Let's talk about the Voyager Vidian phage. Ooh, so
One of the best ones.
the Vidians are, for anybody who doesn't know, Vidians are an alien species out there. And we see them, they look like some sort of weird zombies or something like that. But essentially what's happening is they have a viral disease, the phage, which we'll come back to that, which essentially is just destroying their skin and organs. So what their response to doing this is they essentially harvest skin and organs from other people and then stick it on themselves and then somehow graft it on there. And that's the way they stay alive. They essentially just harvest other people, aliens or otherwise, apparently, and try to keep going. So.
Oh, and I just thought like even just the makeup for the Vidian was so amazing. And in addition to how amazing Star Trek makeup always is, I really love when the makeup sort of is functional also. It just makes sense for the alien. And this one was just so spot on. Because if you look at skin grafts, a lot of times you just lay them on like the bed of tissue and then that's it. So in reality, like they aren't that off. Whereas you're just getting like multiple layers of skin grafts put on your face, for example, and they don't look that healthy and the edges sort of like start coming up a little bit, especially as they reject, or like spots will reject it. Just whoever, I mean, I'm assuming it's Michael Westmore who did the makeup. It's such good research. And like when the Vidian puts on Durst.
Oh my gosh, face, yeah, in the episode Faces.
To try and look hot for B'Elanna. Durst is like a human. He thinks maybe she'd like that more because he's sort of like end stage with his phage disease. Like it looks a lot fresher because it hasn't been sitting there to reject yet, because I guess part of the Vidian phage is that over time, the tissue that they do take, the tissue or the organs that they do take and graft onto the patients, it does get rejected later. So it was interesting to see like how good they are at, this is what it would look like fresh on the person. And this is what it looks like layers. And if you look at it, like the upper layers looked fresher and the edges are cleaner than the bottom layers. They even did some close-ups and I was just like, whoever did that makeup it was phenomenal. And actually it's at one point, like the doctor even like touches it like on Dinara Pell in Life Signs when he's and looking at her cortical stimulator, and he even touches it and it stays intact. And and or I guess it was, what did they call it? Hold on one second. It was a cool name. Oh yeah, just a neurocortical stimulator, which
was it stimulator?
In itself was really cool because that's how there's some like it's not brand new. But some Parkinson's patients, they implant like deep brain stimulators into the part where Parkinson's is attacking. And so it's actually basically the same treatment as was used in Voyager for the Vidian, where then like impulses are sent there trying to make it act normally again, which I just basically, I'm a big dork for the phage episodes. I love them.
I have a question for you about that. So the phage does not infect humans, I'm assuming, because I mean they're exposed to it all the time, and we're fine. If they take, let's say for example that the one who took Durst's face and put it on, you mentioned it had.
Oh, the sociopath.
Yeah, the sociopath guy. Yeah. So would basically, as that falls apart, would it be falling apart because the phage is infecting it, or just because the alien is rejecting the skin, or a little bit of both?
I think it's rejection.
Okay.
Because the interesting part about these phage episodes is it is unclear exactly what a phage is. So
I was going to come back to that.
Yeah. So it's hard to know if they're being like, if it's an infection and that's then what like drives everything, or if it's the infection. It sounds like it's an infection causing a problem with the DNA, and then that's a problem with like organ and structure integrity, and then when they're grafting all of these things and transplanting all these things from other aliens, it's also dealing with the rejection of not being able to like contain them immune system.
You're right. They did make a
But
comment about the infection affecting DNA. I forgot about that. That's a very good catch and very important in terms of figuring out how the phage is working.
yeah, and they do mention, like, especially in the first episode where we meet the Vidians in the phage with Neelix losing his lung,
Yeah.
there's a lot of talk about that, since that's clearly like focusing on transplants
Yeah.
later on in the episode, and not only the ethics of it, but also they mentioned like keeping Neelix immunosuppressed to be able to accept another lung. And it seems like the aliens, why there's one of the reasons they're so good at like advanced medicine is because they've studied immunosuppression so much to be able to take organs from other people,
not have the rejections happen. Yeah.
And that's always like the main one of the main struggles with people to people transplants. And so I thought
much less aliens.
yeah
From another quadrant.
But yeah, it's really cool.
That's really cool. So for anybody who doesn't know, a phage is short for bacteriophage. So phage are real things. However, phage here on Earth don't attack people. Phage here on Earth, phage is short for bacteriophage, meaning it's basically a virus that attacks a bacteria. So this virus will come in, it'll penetrate into the bacteria and insert its code in there. The bacteria, then its machinery is taken over, where it starts producing more and more of the virus, and eventually that bacteria explodes with lots more viruses getting spread out there. So they're probably like some of the most common life-related things out there is bacteriophage. They're super, super common. And in fact, there's something that occasionally get leveraged for medical treatments, because we can have a phage therapy if we have, for example, we have a lot of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but they're not phage resistant.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
And like one of the really cool applications that sort of ties in with this episode, although not because of the science going on in the episode, but a big area of phage therapy study is for wounds in humans. And so one of the tricky parts of like healing a non-healing wound in a human is that a lot of times, like for example, like ulcer wounds with like decreased vascular flow with like diabetes or heart disease, you don't have the blood flow going right to the wound anymore because it's a vascular problem that's what's causing it to not heal. So the question is, if you're taking like an oral or an IV antibiotic, how is the antibiotic going to get to that wound and penetrate it and be able to heal it? Or there'll be like a biofilm on it, which is like a bunch of bacteria sort of like knitted together. And it's like hard to penetrate that, especially through the blood. So what some of the studies that have been done, a lot of ones like early last century before antibiotics, but again now, because of all the resistance, like you said, is just putting it on topically and then coming from like outside into the wound. It can do some good, sort of like actually a parallel is like maggot therapy also, which is done for like amputees to like get at the wound because it's hard to get the antibiotics to the like dead tissue and lack of blood supply. So phages are really fascinating. But like obviously the downside, especially has been proven with COVID, is that viruses just aren't the most predictable. And it can be, especially now, I think it's at the forefront of everybody's mind, like be careful with the research and like what you're doing, what you're trying to get them to do, because you never know.
But
it's fascinating. So it's hard to know, but it's hard to know in this Voyager episode if they're talking about a bacteriophage precisely and where in the body it would hit.
I think they just grabbed the word because the word's kind of cool, but it's clearly not I'm assuming it's not bacteria. I'm assuming it's not just attacking their bacteria, because the effect would not be nearly that bad.
I guess the other thing I left out is they are very specific for like whatever you're treating. So the other nice thing is you won't get side effects like diarrhea and things where it's attacking like gut biome,
100%
your gut microbiome, like the bacteria that lives in your gut and helps you digest things. But I think, what I thought about this episode, like watching it when it initially ran, I assumed phage just meant maybe it had the same structure as a bacteriophage, like you see in pictures.
The shape and
how
and
maybe
operates.
Like the mechanism to get into a cell where it like basically pokes a hole, then injects something.
Injects the RNA or whatever it is. That's cool.
That was my headcanon.
I like it. It works. Let's do a couple of questions from social media, and then if we have time, we'll come back to some of the other questions. So this one is from Facebook. This one's from Dr. Norman Johnson. How did the space tardigrades in Discovery Season 1 get so big? This is a great question because this ties to a fundamental biophysics principle. It's called the square cube rule. So this is one of the reasons that like we think ants are like super strong, like, oh my gosh, this little ant can carry this giant leaf. Yeah, they're actually not as strong as you think. And I think a lot of this comes about because volume, right, is what determines mass or weight, basically. Like the bigger you are, the more mass you have. But also, as you get bigger, you essentially have bigger muscles and things like that. Now, muscle activity basically goes up with essentially the cross-sectional area. So it goes up with the square. So for example, imagine something is like 2 inches long. And if you make it doubly as big, it would then be 4 times the area, but 8 times the volume. So you've increased the ability to carry by 4 times, but you've increased how much it has to carry by 8 times. So as you get bigger and bigger, things can't carry so much. So in the context of the space tardigrade, if it was on Earth and gravity, it would absolutely collapse upon itself. There's no way. I mean, it would have to be so strong to do anything. The good thing about it is, of course, it is in space. So in terms of being able to hold itself up, that's not so much of an issue. Now, the big question, of course, with them is, where does it get its mass and energy? It's like floating around in space. I think there was something about it consuming alpha particles or some really small particles. You remember this? I can't remember exactly. I remember there was some passing mention about they didn't
hard to pay attention when they're having a great space party.
Yeah.
In the same episode.
It was that one, yeah.
And magic to make the famous man go mad.
Exactly. That's exactly the episode from first season of Discovery. But the amount of mass it would take to make something that big is pretty high. Like, and it's just floating around in space.
And
Where's
the
it getting
energy.
that mass? And the energy, yeah.
Because you're not having to hold yourself up from the gravity on Earth, but like a lot of the way that you'll have things travel in your body is through the bloodstream, and you need like the gravity of things being pulled down to reach like end of extremities, unless you're going to use up energy to get it there.
Yep.
Like gravity can be your friend, sort of like easing that process.
Yeah. It's also unclear, why does it have the little like flipper things? It's like, what does that do in space? It would make more sense to have like a big sail.
I heard they're
right?
cute.
And
it's good for merchandising. Yeah. And build a bear.
Yeah, but like
that is a great question.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I'm confusing the space whale with the tardigrade. My bad. Sorry, I was confusing the space whale with it. The tardigrade, I was getting those two things mixed up. It was the space whale that was consuming stuff from outer space, not the tardigrade. We actually don't know what the tardigrade eats. I mean, unless it's something I'm associated with the
Harvey Munn.
Yeah, maybe it's eating. That was the space
whale.
It
seemed like he didn't digest. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting those mixed up too. My bad.
You know what? I was just trying to remember if, like, in that Star Trek Short Treks episode with the tardigrade, I feel like we didn't see him eating anything either during the.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, unless it has to do with the mycelia, I'm not going there. Any other thoughts on the target? Sorry, I got those two things mixed up a little bit there, but I mean, the same principles apply for both. They're both out in space and they have the same problems. So. Right, next one. This one is from Instagram. It's from Katie Carr. In Picard, in regard to the Vulcans and Romulans, why did some Romulans have protruding foreheads as opposed to their Vulcan cousins who did not have protruding foreheads? You want to take first stab at that one? I talked a lot the last one.
Okay. So you have to think about like going back, like where's the lineage, like the common point on their lineage before they branch off in the tree for evolution. So clearly the thoughts are that Romulans and Vulcans share a common ancestor. So the question then is, did they all start off with just like rough ancestors and then diverge? So, okay, but then Vulcans have no ridges, right?
Yeah, they have smooth foreheads.
Then you wonder if, so either they were all rough and then they went to their separate planets and the rough just went away on the Vulcans and it went away in some on the Romulans, or they had a smooth common ancestor, and the rough just like
just evolved on Romulus.
Yeah, so that they're both are coexisting and it's not like a different species thing.
Yeah, so there's a principle called parsimony, which is what it sounds like. It's basically the simplest explanation is usually the right one. So in that sense, the first of those involves two changes, right? Where like the ancestor here had to, well, actually, does it involve two? No, actually, I guess they both just involve one because it's one loss versus one gain, right? But I guess
Oh yeah, but it would have to be lost in 2 instead of 1.
oh yeah, that's right. It would have to,
Right.
well, unless, well, yeah, I guess so. I guess so. Yeah. It's interesting just since the simplest explanation is the easiest. So if something came, landed on Vulcan, still had smooth, landed on Romulus, and then a subset evolved a different type. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we see, there is variation among, say, human populations in, for example, eye shape. There is variation in species with, on a single planet. So that part's fair. But it's interesting, just the simplest explanation is usually the best. Now, of course, in that context, if let's say the ancestor, let's say if we know another species that's neither Vulcan nor Romulan, but we'll use human, they have smooth foreheads. So there it makes it very simple to think, okay, it's probably evolved on Romulus as opposed to like something that was somehow hidden for a long time and lost multiple times. But that's something that's used a lot in figuring out how these traits work. Now, it's not 100% true because sometimes a trait can be lost multiple times. I mean, that does happen, but usually the simplest explanation is the best.
And it's interesting because it doesn't, from what they always say in Star Trek, it doesn't seem like it was thousands of years when Romulans and Vulcans like separated. So it makes it a little less likely to be believed, I think, especially because they, at least Vulcans have really long lifespans.
Yeah.
But the thing that like sort of trips me up when I'm thinking about it is that why would the ridges be like better than smooth? What would the difference be? And I'm like, you know what, maybe just because people don't necessarily think like having ridges down your forehead would be like the most attractive quality. Maybe, who knows, like, there it could be. Yeah. And so maybe it's like Chabon, Laris's husband, he had the ridges, and so maybe that was more attractive to Laris, and that's
I think he was smooth, wasn't he?
Oh, and she was ridged.
I think that's the way it was.
But maybe that's like whichever one was smooth. Maybe the ridged ones are more attractive, and that's why they've been developing more and more after the divergence of everybody being smooth.
And it doesn't. I'm glad you raised that, because in a sense it doesn't have to have a function. So there's an interesting principle. It's called the sexy sun principle. That essentially, if you have genetic variation in a preference, so let's say some people like ridges and some people don't. Well, let's say ancestrally nobody has ridges. Right? And then so you have genetic variation where some people like ridges and some don't, and you have a population then where one son gets this ridge. That one will of course get more matings because of the females who happen to find that sexy, and he will then pass it on because he has sexy sons. And essentially, even if there's no value to it beyond just that this preference exists in the population, it will spread, and as it spreads, it creates this genetic correlation between the trait and the preference, which makes the preference for the ridges also spread. It's a fascinating principle.
So interesting.
It's been modeled many times too, and it works very well, and until eventually everybody has both or pretty close to it at least. So that's great. Last question from the audience, and we'll come back to some other stuff if we have extra time. This is from Dr. Mike Wong on Facebook. If you could hire one character from the Star Trek universe to join your medical research team, who would it be and why?
Okay, you go first.
Go with Data, just because he's like the Swiss Army knife guy. Basically whatever you need,
like radiation.
He can, exactly, he can do anything, he knows everything. He's the Swiss Army knife guy, and he's not as limited as the Doctor. He doesn't have this little mobile emitter that can then get lost. So I think I'd have to go with Data. I mean, he'd be super helpful.
That's a good one. I'm gonna go with the EMH only because he has like the added knowledge of all the nanoprobes and nanostructure technology. True. And that I think there's like, as evidenced by like later Voyager, there's so many applications of that. And he seems like it seems to save the day a lot. So that's awesome. Because of that, but I think, as I already told you before, if I had a good team already in place, then Kirk, just because I have a crush on him.
Fair enough.
not that that's professional, but it'd be nice to have him on my ship.
I'm sure William Shatner's watching this right now and being like,
yeah. No, he's getting ready to go to space.
That's right. I forgot about that. We have a little bit of extra time, so let's jump back to one of these older ones. Next Generation. Can you comment on the events in the Next Generation episode Unnatural Selection, where some genetically enhanced individuals on Darwin Station had an immune system that spread antibodies, causing aging in Dr. Pulaski and others?
This one is so interesting. So interesting for so many reasons. But like, so there's like a lot of interesting science about how they genetically engineered that
Yep.
the children on the planet. And
Mhm.
then because somebody had the flu who was on like a cargo ship, came to the planet, and then the children have like such a high and like advanced immune system. They make antibodies, and then the
They shoot
antibodies
out.
become airborne,
Yeah.
which is a really interesting part of that. And as I was like doing a marathon yesterday, that's not the only time antibodies become airborne in Star Trek.
Oh yeah.
And so the antibodies are like too much for other people to handle, and it kind of like attacks their bodies and makes them age faster, and then kills them, whereas the children just look healthy.
Yeah. What did you think specifically about the response being aging? Like, it wasn't like it's just attacking you and hurting you, but it's making you like age. Like, oh, that's
Age specifically is interesting. It's like I would have expected it to be. I'm not saying I don't think it's cool.
yeah, no. Story wise, it's great.
Yeah, and maybe I was trying to like do some somersaults in my head to try and come up with a way. So basically, what I would expect to happen is if it's too general or too like strong of an antibody for the normal human to withstand, maybe, and from like what the results were, especially like the arthritis at first, which was just like a generalized inflammation. Maybe it's just like a normal person's immune system just like goes into overdrive and starts attacking themselves a little bit, and not just the virus that you're exposed to. Sort of like the pathophysiology for asthma or certain cancers or certain kinds of arthritis, basically like autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
So I think maybe somehow on that level, just like the generalized inflammation triggers the inflammation that would happen like with aging arthritis, and or something, or somehow like the inflammation messes with the genetic replication to replace cells, and somehow that triggers like the telomeres to start shortening.
Yeah. I mean, one other symptom of aging is your epigenetics gets messed up, right? So epigenetics, so you have everything has DNA, but then certain genes are turned on and off. That's why certain cells keep reproducing other kinds of the same cell. So they all have the same DNA, but certain genes in them are turned on and off in a way that actually, when it reproduces, those same genes within a body, when it reproduces, those same cells are turned on and off. So maybe it messes your epigenetic programming, and that's maybe what causes something that looks a little bit more like aging in some sense. I mean, I'm speculating here. But
that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, or just like when, for example, like if you get scars and then you keep scarring in the scar tissue, you maybe could actually say it imitates a little bit like what severe aging would look like with the wrinkles, just if it isn't healing properly.
Yeah, totally.
But it did look like, they did say, I think, that like internal organs seem to age a lot too.
Yeah. Which I mean, still could be epigenetic, like it's just messing up all your epigenetics inside. Who knows?
So interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. And they call it unnatural selection. I think that's not referring to what's going on with respect to the antibodies, but it's referring to the fact that these people on the colony were actually genetically engineered, and therefore there was selection that had happened, or at least it's not exactly right. It's called selection.
Shocking.
It's more genetic manipulation. But anyway.
Yes, and like who okayed that?
Yeah, I know, right? Study. And then that was the unnatural part to it, I guess. Yeah. But it's also called Darwin's Station too.
Oh yeah. I love that like Picard at some point was like, they were like, where was it? Oh, where did I write? Oh well. Oh, they were like, it's the future of humanity, and Picard's like Dr. Kingsley's version of it.
Yeah.
Because like, it's clearly like they felt like a little bit crazy strongly about some of the decisions that were being made at the station that kind of made it seem secretive.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know too, like in the end of the episode, the people at the station were going to stay and help take care of the children, and they said it as if they were like their own offspring. So I was like, where did the children come from? Like that.
Yeah, what was the starting material?
Yes. Are they actually their real children? In which case, that seems very weird and problematic. But
that connects with a lot of like Deep Space Nine episodes too, which we won't go into now, but that connects with a lot of those too.
They were like real people.
Yeah,
it was nuts. Yeah,
no, that's true. That's true. We got just a couple minutes left, so let's just do one quick one. I'll just randomly pick one. Oh, can individuals de-evolve like in the Next Generation episode Genesis by an intron virus? So I should say intron aspect was very interesting there. So So what happened in this episode, just for context, Data and Picard go away. When they come back, everybody on the ship has de-evolved, which, I mean, that term by itself is horrible. Like, first of all, individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. Individuals develop. Like, I didn't evolve from a baby into an adult. I developed. So there's no.
You were already advanced.
And there's no direction of evolution. There's no de-evolving. I mean, things can evolve in one direction and evolve back in another direction. It's not de-evolving. But anyway, setting all that aside, that's minor. There was an interesting aspect here where they suggested that this all happened because introns were turned on. And Data gives a definition of an intron, which unfortunately is not exactly right. He's actually, what he meant to refer to was what's called a pseudogene. So he said these are like dead genes that are remnants from the past. I don't remember his exact quote, but something like, a gene that used to have a function but no longer has a function anymore in a person. That's actually not an intron. That's called a pseudogene. It's okay, just a terminological trip there. What introns actually are is like, there are parts of your genes that actually encode for protein, and there's little parts that are kind of like spacer in between. Intron is that spacer in there. So that, I mean, turning those on will just make you make a whole bunch of like crap proteins. That's most of what that would end up doing.
that have like a really weird name, because every time like I study for a test, you think intron means they're left in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, exons are the ones that are left
spliced out. So like,
yeah.
I always for any exam, just remember it's the opposite.
Yeah, well said. The other thing too is, even if you did turn on your pseudogenes, they've surely over the course of evolutionary time accumulated a ton of mutations. So turning them on, they're just going to make crazy stuff. They're not going to make something that actually would work well. So we, for example, humans have a pseudogene for vitamin C. That most mammals out there just make their own vitamin C. Like, your dog doesn't need to have vitamin C tablets or oranges or anything like that. It's fine. It makes its own vitamin C. For us, we have to get it from diet. We have the gene for it, the GLO gene, but it's actually been basically broken up. So it's now a pseudogene. If you turn it on, you're just going to make like bad protein. It's still not going to help you make vitamin C.
So that one is always so fascinating to me too, because obviously, like, if you don't have vitamin C, you get scurvy, like the sailors used to get without oranges. So like, it's just, so that's one where it's always interesting to think about, like, because clearly you would think it would behoove humanity to be able to make it themselves, but it must have just been some random thing where one of the proteins in it got messed up and then it doesn't work anymore anyway.
There must have been some human population, or maybe all humans at the time, just had so much access to vitamin C in their diet that it just didn't matter. That when the mutation came and broke it, it didn't affect anything. And eventually it just spread through. It didn't necessarily spread through selection, because it's just spread through random processes. And then later on, I mean, because people weren't sailing like, tens of thousands of years ago across the ocean. That's when they became the limeys.
Yeah.
But then that came up much later as a problem because of that. So I think we're just about out of time. Let me check the timer. Yep, we're actually just about out of time. Do you have any final thoughts on just something
that
you thought
one
was cool?
interesting thing at the really end of that episode, Genesis, where they name the disease after Barclay, like Barclay's protomorphosis syndrome.
Yeah.
And it's just one really interesting note, in addition to how, like, in other areas of science, like virology, you're trying to not name things after places or historical events or people necessarily, especially who suffered from it. So like stigma,
like Legionnaire's
all of
disease and stuff like that.
Or like there's a Ford's disease, which I won't tell you what that is. You can look it up. Jeep's disease. But but in terms of like for medicine in particular, first of all, it would have been named Crusher protomorphosis syndrome, because basically a lot of times it'll be after the physician who sort of like discovered it or studied it. But really trying to get away from that, just because there's already so much to learn and remember in terms of new words, and everything, especially like in the last couple of centuries, like with everybody doing that, naming it after themselves, it becomes very hard to learn, like, and be clear what's being spoken about, and also is it an internationally known eponym. So some of my professors in med school are very against eponyms, so like would require all of us to use like the words like press for title, things being changed to names that describe what they are, so that it can be used universally.
Protomorphosis virus.
Yes, exactly. Or maybe, exactly, something like that. Not even Enterprise. You don't want to like give a stigma to the ship. But
definitely not. Well, kudos to Star Trek for a lot of great content, both in science and medicine. And big thank you to Dr. Anne-Marie Siegel for being here for this panel. It was a lot of fun to talk science with you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Best day ever.
I hope you guys watching it enjoyed too, and live long and prosper.
Okay.